A thought flashes, a memory stirs, and before you realize it, the body tightens, the mind already spinning its familiar narrative. This is how most emotions rule, silently, automatically. But there is a moment, subtle and easily missed, when awareness steps in. The act of seeing changes the scene. Observation, when pure and sustained, weakens the invisible grip that feelings and attachments hold over behavior. Not because emotion disappears, but because attention stops feeding it. In that instant, anger, fear, or desire lose their authority. They are revealed as movements of energy, not identity. What remains is space, the quiet strength of one who watches without resistance or indulgence. Emotions are fast. They arise before thought can translate them into words. A tone of voice, a gesture, a memory. Each triggers a cascade of chemical and neural signals that shape how we feel long before we know we're feeling. Most of this happens beneath conscious awareness. The body contracts, the breath shortens, the pulse accelerates. By the time the mind arrives to interpret what's happening, the emotional wave has already defined the inner climate. This is the automatic nature of emotion, a system built for survival, not for understanding. Evolution trained the human organism to react before reflecting. A rustle in the grass could be the wind or a predator. Hesitation might mean death. So the brain learned to favor speed over precision. The amygdala fires, hormones surge, muscles prepare. This reactive loop kept us alive for millennia. But in the modern landscape, where threats are mostly social or psychological, this same machinery often misfires. The argument at work, the judgment from a stranger, the fear of loss. These are not tigers, yet our body responds as if they were. Observation enters here not as suppression, but as illumination. To observe an emotion is to notice its unfolding without collapsing into its storyline. It's the moment of standing in the doorway rather than being pulled into the room. Metacognition, thinking about thinking, extends that distance further. It's the shift from "I am angry" to "anger is arising." That small linguistic change signals a vast psychological one. The self moves from actor to witness, from identification to awareness. When you practice observing your emotions, you begin to see patterns once invisible. You notice how sadness tends to appear in the chest, how anxiety buzzes in the gut, how frustration tenses the jaw. These sensations become data points, not enemies. The body, instead of being hijacked, becomes a sensitive instrument of information. Each reaction is a message, but you no longer confuse the message with who you are. This is where power returns. You stop being driven and start being aware of the driver. Metacognition functions like a mirror placed between impulse and response. It doesn't block emotion, it reflects it, slowing time enough for choice to emerge. The automatic reaction becomes visible, and visibility transforms it. Neuroscientifically, this moment recruits the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for reasoning, empathy, and regulation. Each act of observation subtly rewires neural pathways, weakening the dominance of the old emotional circuits. Over time, the brain learns that awareness itself is safety, that seeing clearly is more adaptive than reacting blindly. But this isn't an intellectual trick. Observation requires intimacy with experience, not analysis from a distance. When anger rises, for example, the ordinary mind seeks to justify or reject it. I shouldn't feel this way, or they made me angry. Observation asks something simpler. What does this feel like right now? You notice the heat in the skin, the rhythm of the breath, the pulse in the temple. No story, no judgment, just contact. As attention deepens, the emotion begins to lose its sharpness. You realize that anger, like weather, has movement, texture, and impermanence. This is where metacognition becomes liberation rather than control. You are not trying to fix the feeling, but to see it with such precision that its structure becomes transparent. Through that transparency, attachment fades. The emotion might still move through you, but it no longer defines your choices or contaminates your perception. You start to sense the difference between energy and identity, between what happens in consciousness and what you are as consciousness. Every moment of honest observation is an act of deconditioning. It dismantles the reflex that confuses feeling with truth. Just because you feel unworthy doesn't mean you are. Just because fear appears doesn't mean danger is present. When awareness witnesses emotion without believing its narrative, the emotional charge dissipates. It's like oxygen being withdrawn from a fire. What remains is clarity, the mind's natural state when not clouded by reaction. In daily life, this can look very simple. You pause before replying to a harsh message. You notice the tension in your body before speaking in a meeting. You catch the subtle contraction when someone disagrees with you. Each pause is a microsecond of freedom, a place where choice can live. Observation doesn't promise calmness all the time. It promises consciousness, which is deeper and more reliable. Over time, you begin to see emotions less as storms to survive and more as waves revealing the sea beneath them. Each feeling becomes a teacher, pointing back to the observer itself. The automatic machinery of reaction loses authority, not because it disappears, but because something larger, awareness, has taken its rightful seat. This is the quiet revolution of metacognition, turning the spotlight inward until even the subtlest movements of thought and feeling are seen for what they are, transient patterns within a vast, still field of consciousness. When that recognition stabilizes, the old question, how do I control my emotions, changes to, who is the one aware of them? From that vantage, emotion no longer needs management, it needs space. Observation provides that space, and in that spaciousness, the power once held by automatic reactions dissolves naturally, replaced by a calm intelligence that doesn't need to suppress or explain. It simply sees, and in seeing, it frees. Inside the brain, two ancient forces coexist in a delicate negotiation. One is primitive, impulsive, fast, the amygdala, the body's alarm bell. The other is deliberate, reflective, patient, the prefrontal cortex, the region of conscious regulation. Every emotion you experience is shaped by their dialogue. When a trigger appears, the amygdala reacts first, flooding the system with signals of urgency. The body tenses, hormones surge, perception narrows. Then, a fraction of a second later, the prefrontal cortex receives the message and interprets it, asking, is this truly a threat, or merely a memory echoing in the nervous system? That sliver of time between reaction and reflection is where the power of observation lives. Observation strengthens the bridge between these two regions. When you consciously notice your inner state without trying to change it, you activate the prefrontal cortex, which in turn calms the amygdala's alarm. Neuroscientists call this top-down regulation. It is not suppression, it is integration. The more you observe sensations, thoughts, and emotions in real time, the more neural pathways are built between awareness and reactivity. Over time, this connection becomes faster and more efficient, allowing reflective intelligence to intervene earlier in the emotional sequence. The result is a nervous system that trusts observation as its first response instead of panic. Consider what happens when anger flares. In the unobserved mind, the amygdala commands, attack or defend. The body obeys, tension builds, and the words that follow often leave a trail of regret. But when awareness steps in, even half a second sooner, the prefrontal cortex begins to light up. Studies using functional MRI show that labeling an emotion, even silently, reduces amygdala activity. Saying inwardly, "This is anger," transforms the experience from chaos to clarity. The act of naming recruits language networks that pull the brain from the limbic storm into cognitive territory. In other words, attention becomes regulation. Observation changes the chemistry of perception. When mindfulness practitioners train their awareness, measurable shifts occur in neurotransmitter balance, serotonin increases, cortisol decreases, and the default mode network, the circuit of self-referential thought, quiets down. This doesn't erase emotion, but softens the identification with it. The brain begins to interpret emotional energy as information, not identity. You start to feel sadness without being sad, to witness fear without being ruled by it. The space created by observation is not theoretical, it is biological. The beauty of this process lies in its humility. The prefrontal cortex doesn't dominate the amygdala through force, it befriends it through understanding. Each time you stay present with discomfort instead of escaping it, you're teaching your nervous system that awareness is safe. The body learns that it no longer needs to launch a full-scale defense against internal sensations. Gradually, emotional resilience emerges, not as numbness but as flexibility. This is how observation transforms the reactive brain into a reflective one, not by suppressing emotion, but by widening the corridor through which energy can move. When observed deeply, emotions begin to lose their deceptive speed. You start to sense their earliest whispers, tiny shifts in breath, tone, or posture, before they mature into full reactions. These microsignals are like ripples before a wave. Noticing them in time allows you to respond with intelligence rather than instinct. Neuroscience describes this as increasing interoceptive awareness, the ability to perceive internal bodily states. High interoceptive awareness correlates with emotional regulation and empathy, because the more you understand your own sensations, the more attuned you become to others. Observation, therefore, refines not only self-control, but also connection. Another dimension of observation's power lies in neuroplasticity. Every moment of conscious awareness lays a new pathway, reinforcing the habit of attention itself. The brain, constantly rewiring, prioritizes what is repeatedly practiced. When reactivity is repeated, those circuits strengthen. When observation is repeated, the reflective circuits become dominant. Over months or years, this shift can be measured structurally: increased gray matter density in the prefrontal cortex and decreased volume in the amygdala. The architecture of the brain literally mirrors the architecture of consciousness. Seeing becomes sculpting. Yet observation is not a cold detachment. It carries warmth, curiosity, even compassion. When you witness an emotion without judgment, the prefrontal cortex engages areas linked to empathy, such as the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. These regions bridge cognitive understanding with embodied feeling. You don't distance yourself from the emotion as an outsider. You include it within awareness as part of a living system. This compassionate inclusion rewires the nervous system to respond with balance instead of suppression. The mind learns to hold both stimulus and serenity in the same breath. Over time, observation begins to feel less like an effort and more like the brain's natural state. The dialogue between amygdala and cortex becomes harmonious rather than adversarial. Emotional energy still arises, but it moves through a field of presence that doesn't amplify it. Imagine two instruments in tune. One vibrates, the other resonates without distortion. This is the sound of coherence within consciousness, a steady rhythm of awareness where thought, emotion, and physiology operate as allies. From this perspective, emotional mastery is not about dominance, but about integration. The goal isn't to silence the amygdala. It's to refine its signals through the intelligence of observation. When the reflective circuits are active, perception expands, time slows, and decisions become grounded. The reactive self wants control. The reflective self wants understanding. Observation is the bridge that allows the latter to guide the former. In the end, the neuroscience of observation reveals what contemplative traditions have known for centuries. Awareness is the true regulator. Each act of noticing, each moment of pausing before reacting, alters the brain's internal conversation. The circuitry of fear gives way to the circuitry of clarity. What was once an impulsive reflex becomes a conscious response. Through the steady practice of observation, the human brain evolves beyond survival toward wisdom, an intelligence that doesn't fight emotion but transforms it into insight. To observe without interference is to touch the edge of freedom. Yet this freedom does not arrive as an idea. It emerges through disidentification, the quiet art of seeing without being the seen. Most people live under the assumption that their thoughts and feelings define who they are. The phrase "I am sad" fuses emotion and identity, collapsing the vast field of awareness into a single passing wave. But the truth is simpler. Sadness is happening within you, not as you. When that distinction becomes lived rather than intellectual, the power of attachment begins to dissolve. Attachments are not only emotional ties to people or things, they are habits of identification. We attach to roles, memories, and even wounds because they give continuity to the self-image. The mind clings to them as proof of existence. I am this kind of person. I always react that way. I need this to feel safe. Observation, however, exposes the fragility of those definitions. It reveals that what you call me is actually a fluid intersection of sensations, thoughts, and impulses, constantly changing. To witness that movement without grasping is to begin disidentifying from it. This disidentification is not an act of denial. You do not reject emotion or attachment. You simply stop mistaking them for the core of your being. Like clouds passing through an open sky, they appear, shift, and vanish. The sky does not resist or cling. It allows. That allowing is consciousness itself. Each time you observe an attachment rising, whether it's the craving for approval, the fear of loss, or the pride of being right, you create a subtle distance that redefines the relationship. The attachment may still exist, but it no longer governs perception. From the standpoint of neuroscience, this detachment reflects a reduction in the brain's default mode network, the set of regions that maintain the narrative of I, me, and mine. When observation strengthens, this network quiets, allowing other circuits responsible for empathy, sensory awareness, and present moment experience to take precedence. The story of self becomes porous, less absolute. In that loosened identity, emotional grip weakens naturally. What once felt like a permanent part of you is now recognized as a temporary pattern of energy. This process can feel unsettling at first. The ego interprets disidentification as loss, as if something vital were being taken away. Yet what disappears is only confusion, the reflex of believing that inner content equals identity. When you rest as the observer, you still experience joy, pain, love, and fear, but they no longer imprison awareness. They move freely through you, leaving understanding instead of residue. Disidentification doesn't make you indifferent. It makes you transparent to experience. The world is still vivid, perhaps even more so, but the sense of ownership fades. Life flows through you rather than around you. Over time, observation reveals the cyclical nature of attachment itself. You start to notice how craving alternates with disappointment, how possession feeds anxiety, how resistance deepens suffering. When you see these cycles clearly, the motivation to cling weakens on its own. You stop trying to extract permanence from impermanent things. This shift is not an act of will, but a natural consequence of insight. The observer understands that grasping and aversion are two sides of the same illusion, the belief that happiness depends on control. Disidentification is the most intimate act of freedom because it doesn't require withdrawal from life. It happens in the middle of it, in the tension of relationships, the uncertainty of work, the silence of solitude. You remain engaged, but no longer entangled. Your attention becomes the meeting place between the personal and the impersonal, between story and stillness. Each emotion, once a threat, becomes a messenger guiding you back to the space that watches. When observation deepens, even the observer itself becomes transparent. You realize that there is no separate witness behind the eyes, just awareness aware of itself. The division between observer and observed collapses into a seamless field of presence. Attachments dissolve not because you pushed them away, but because they can't survive in the light of such clarity. What remains is simplicity, perception unfiltered by need. If you want to test this directly, try a small experiment. Notice something you've been clinging to, a belief, a possession, a person, or an outcome, and bring it into awareness without judging or justifying it. Watch how your body reacts. Does it tighten, soften, defend, crave? Then ask quietly, who is the one aware of this attachment? Stay with that question without answering. The sensation may change, but the awareness remains. That awareness is who you truly are. When this insight begins to take root, a subtle joy arises. Not the thrill of gaining, but the peace of no longer needing to. The heart expands where once it contracted. You can care deeply without depending. You can love without fear of loss. And in that space, life regains its original lightness. If this reflection touched something real in you, write in the comments, I see the space between what I feel and who I am. Let that sentence become your own declaration of awareness, a reminder that the act of seeing is already the beginning of freedom. Observation becomes real only when it enters the territory of daily life. The kitchen, the commute, the endless stream of conversations and choices that shape our days. Theory alone does not dissolve emotional patterns, practice does. The art lies in turning ordinary moments into laboratories of awareness, where each reaction, each discomfort, becomes an invitation to see rather than to act on impulse. The simplest doorway is attention to the body. The body never lies. It records every emotion as movement, tension, or temperature. When irritation arises, for instance, the mind jumps to reasons, but the body already knows it's there. The shoulders lift, the breath becomes shallow, the jaw sets. To notice these signals without trying to correct them is the first act of observation in motion. You might be speaking with someone who triggers you. Pause for half a second and feel the contact of your feet on the floor, the rhythm of your breathing, the pulse beneath your skin. This awareness doesn't erase emotion, but it anchors you in presence, preventing the automatic takeover of reactivity. Another practical gateway is mindful speech. Words often carry the residue of unobserved emotion. When awareness is absent, conversation becomes a projection of inner turbulence. Observation transforms dialogue into reflection. Before responding, sense the impulse behind your words. Are you trying to defend, to impress, to control? The moment you see the motivation, even silently, it loses its unconscious power. What follows is speech that emerges from clarity rather than conditioning. Over time, this simple discipline reshapes relationships from arenas of reaction into spaces of understanding. Observation also extends into how we relate to time. Most attachments are future-oriented, the longing for what might be or the fear of what could go wrong. The mind spins in anticipation, and emotion feeds on that projection. Bringing awareness to the present interrupts this loop. A practical exercise is to check several times a day whether your body is where your thoughts are. If the mind is already in tomorrow, notice that dissonance. The recognition itself restores coherence. Observation here is not about forcing yourself to stay in the moment, but about realizing when you've left it. The return happens naturally, without struggle. Even mundane routines can become rituals of observation. Washing dishes, walking to the car, or turning off the light before bed, all are opportunities to notice the rhythm of the body and the texture of thought. What matters is not the activity, but the quality of attention within it. When awareness saturates action, the distinction between the observer and the observed blurs. A quiet intelligence begins to guide movement, making even simple gestures feel deliberate and alive. In moments of strong emotion, observation may seem impossible, yet those are precisely the moments when it matters most. When fear or anger surges, try not to suppress or analyze it. Instead, describe it silently as if you were narrating a natural event. Heat in the chest, heartbeat fast, breath uneven. This neutral labeling keeps you connected to the sensory layer rather than the story. Neuroscience confirms that this technique engages the prefrontal cortex, calming the amygdala's urgency. The body learns over time that emotions can be witnessed safely, that energy can move without spilling into reaction. In relationships, observation takes the form of genuine listening. Instead of preparing a response while someone speaks, allow their words to land completely. Notice how your mind wants to interrupt or correct, and stay silent for a breath. This small act trains awareness to hold space rather than defend territory. It's not submission, it's presence. When you listen this way, the other person often softens too, because they sense that your attention is not reactive. Observation thus becomes contagious. It awakens awareness in those around you. Observation can also reshape how we face uncertainty. Modern life feeds on control, plans, predictions, guarantees. Yet every moment is fundamentally unpredictable. The practice is to meet uncertainty with curiosity instead of anxiety. When something unexpected happens, pause before labeling it as good or bad. Feel the bodily sensations that accompany the unknown. The ability to stay with uncertainty without seeking immediate closure is one of the highest forms of awareness. It signals that consciousness has matured beyond the need for constant certainty. Transformation through observation doesn't require isolation or withdrawal from the world. It unfolds quietly within participation. You still work, love, argue, and dream, but with a different center of gravity. The observer within remains untouched even as life changes shape. Gradually, this inner steadiness influences the outer world. Decisions become clearer, reactions shorter, relationships more honest. What once felt like chaos begins to organize itself around a deeper intelligence. Ultimately, observation is not a technique, but a way of being. Each time you remember to see rather than to judge, to feel rather than to flee, you reinforce the neural and energetic pathways of presence. Practice isn't about perfection. It's about remembrance, returning again and again to the simple awareness that watches without resistance. Over days and years, that returning becomes natural, almost effortless. The observer no longer visits moments of clarity. It lives there, and from that still point life continues, ordinary yet illuminated, human yet profoundly free. Observation is not a retreat from life, but a return to its essence. By seeing without resistance, you uncover the stillness that was always present beneath every thought, emotion, and attachment. The storms of feeling no longer define you. They pass through a sky that does not move. This is freedom, not the absence of emotion, but the end of its tyranny. When awareness becomes the ground of your being, love deepens, clarity sharpens, and action aligns with truth. If you reach this point, leave a comment saying, "I am the space that sees." Like the video if it resonated with you, and subscribe if you want more reflections that explore the quiet power of conscious observation.